successful and a holding against at all times.
Be careful.
Government officials insist that this is isolated incident of the package of grenades. Okay. No,
The boys all stood around the bar and drank their liquor down. It was at O'Connell's pub one night in Campbelltown, when suddenly John Farley came rushing through the door. I've seen a ghost, Fred Fisher's ghost, to all his mates he swore. Fred Fisher had just disappeared and this could mean foul play. No one knew where he had gone or why he went away. And all the boys were silent as Farley told his tale, how Fisher's ghost just stood there leaning on the old stout rail. He stood and pointed to the creek, said Farley with alarm, pointed to the creek that runs below Fred Fisher's farm. And I could see right through him as down the track I fled. I tell you boys, I've seen his ghost, Fred Fisher must be dead. The story of Fred Fisher's ghost soon spread around the town, and in the dusty street next day the people gathered round. Then young Trooper Leland to Fisher's place did go, and with him went black trackers Jackie Gilbert and JoJo. John Farley took them to the spot where Fisher's ghost had stood. Tracker Jackie Gilbert said, I smell a white man's blood. And then Trooper Leland knew he was on the trail, for he had found a smear of blood upon the old stout rail. The two black trackers searched around to see what they could find. They went down to the creek with Leland close behind. Then Gilbert and old JoJo saw marks upon the ground that led them to Fred Fisher's grave beneath the marshy mound. The police found out why Fisher died and how he met his end, and they arrested George Worrall, though he'd been Fisher's friend. When Worrall faced the hangman, a guilty man was he. He confessed before he died upon the gallows tree. So if you go to Fisher's farm a certain night each year, people up in Campbelltown say Fisher will appear. You'll see his ghost at midnight when eerie shadows creep, just leaning on the old stout rail and pointing to the creek. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Dancing Toaster. This is Pastor Nelly, and this is the place where apparently we sing now, but we also still wrestle with the intersection of faith and the unexplained. I hope I didn't butcher the song. I didn't write it, but I did fall in love with it when I heard it while researching this case. That was an actual song called Fisher's Ghost by the Australian folk singer Johnny Ashcroft. What you heard today was my own cover/remix of the song, but more on that in a bit. What are we doing today? Today we are continuing our journey to the top 5 places outside of the US where people are enjoying the Dancing Toaster. And that takes us today to the land down under, to Australia, where we will examine one of the most famous paranormal cases they have down there, the case of Fisher's ghost. So famous it got several songs written about it, but before we start our examination of this tale, what time is it, Vinny? It's time for the thank yous. That's right, and I'm thankful today that we have many thank yous. First, thank you for joining me once again. You could be listening to 1,000 other things, so the fact that you're here is more than I deserve, so I thank you. This month we surpassed 30,000 downloads. For a guy who started in his closet last October, I'm pretty excited about that. Thank you for helping me get to that. To my Aussie listeners, thank you for tuning in all the way on the other side of the planet. I'd love to visit you one day, but your wildlife looks like a real-life horror movie, and your government is like a real-life political thriller. It's more totalitarian every day. No offense, I'm praying for you down there. Unfortunately, Seattle would love to catch up with you, which is awful. Word on the street is some of y'all are pushing back against the crazy. Hopefully more folks wake up. Probably should have said the same thing last week to my UK listeners. Many of the things I've said on this show would have already gotten me a visit from the thought police, I mean the police, and I'd probably be locked up over there already. I didn't know that your government thought V for Vendetta was not a movie, but a playbook. I'm praying for you guys in all seriousness. Enough geopolitics, though. That's not why you're here. Would you hurry up already with them thank yous so we can get this show on the road? Cork it, Doc. It's not like you got anywhere else to be. Anyways, I want to thank Mark, Jackie, and Nathan. All of you guys became Toasties this week. I was blown away. Thank you for the love and support. My Toasties are my patrons over on Patreon. I'm all in on this show, and they are all in on helping me to do it. If you want to join them and help me to do what I do, $5 a month, help support my work, get you early access to content, you get ad-free listening, you get access to exclusives, specifically a new show launching right around the corner, The Toaster Files. They'll be starting with something called MESS, the Ministry of Esoteric Supernatural Studies. I joked last week that it was going to be the Ghostbusters meets the X-Files meets the Chosen. Again, that was totally just a corny joke. The show will be about a team of 5 investigators taking on cases in the fictional northwestern town of Ashwood Pines, but their adventures will take them well beyond the Pacific Northwest and beyond our world. I have a surprise for my Toasties. I was going to wait until later September to announce this, but for your support, you will become honorary citizens of Ashwood Pines. I, of course, won't be using your full legal names as I don't want to dox anyone, but the citizens that make up this beautiful and mysterious fictional town will be the wonderful people that make this show possible. If you've got a special name you want me to use in the script, hit me up in the community tab on Patreon. I plan on starting a chat just for this topic over there. The episodes of the Toaster Files will be broken into chapters and arcs that I can't wait to share with you, and the stories will of course be told in the storytelling style of The Dancing Toaster. I put a full trailer up on the YouTube channel. Go check it out. While you're there, do me a favor and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Even if you don't listen on that platform, I'd really appreciate it. I'm trying to grow that over there too, just trying to sow seed in every direction possible to let as many people know about the show as I can and what I'm doing over here. New merch stuff will be coming with the new show, and unlike before, with the Man-Eating Toaster, I'm gonna keep the Toaster Files exclusive. Yeah, sure you are. Shut up, Dr. Ray, I mean it. No full arcs will be released outside of Patreon, only teasers with the hopes of creating FOMO. Yeah, cause he's broke as a joke. Thank you, Vinny, very eloquent of you. Yes, I do need these lovely folks to join the Patreon, as I am all in on the Dancing Toaster, and Washington State is killing me. If you want to help me continue this work, head over to the Patreon or go to the PayPal or the buymeacoffee.com/The Dancing Toaster. If you want to rep The Dancing Toaster around town, head over to the merch store, get some Dancing Toaster gear at thedancingtoasterstore.printful.me. Thank you to those who have made purchases this week. I appreciate it. I love Printful because they handle all the fulfillment for me. They print the stuff, they pack it, they ship it. They're not a sponsor. I just wouldn't be able to do all that, as well as do all the work that the show requires. That's why they take such a huge cut, but they're doing most of the work. So I just want you guys to be able to rep The Dancing Toaster wherever you're at. Lastly, on a more personal note, thank you for all the wonderful messages that I have received, just encouraging me to keep doing what I'm doing. Many of you have done that. I thank you. Last month I had quite a few, and it caught me off guard. I certainly needed it, and it was welcome, so you guys blow me away. You're amazing. Thank you. Now, enough of the housekeeping. It's time now to properly tell the tale of Fred Fisher's murder and his alleged sightings after his death. Last week, some said my accent kept creeping into Australian instead of British. This week, it's still going to sound British when it pops in because, well, the people involved were mostly prisoners sent to Australia from England. In any case, let's dive in.
Fred Fisher wasn't born in the colonies. He was London blood, 1792 vintage. The kind of man who thought he could outsmart the system with a forged banknote and a steady hand.
It's just ink and paper. Who's it hurt if I'm clever enough to pass it?
But crime has a way of catching up to you, and when it did, the law dropped the hammer hard. His ticket out of England wasn't a ship of dreams. It was a one-way passage in chains bound for New South Wales in 1815. That's how his story began. A man broken down to iron shackles and hard labor. A number on a ledger. Another piece of cargo in the Empire's floating prison. But Fisher wasn't the kind to rot quietly. Somewhere under the grime and grit, he had a survivor's instinct. He played the game, served his time, and earned himself a ticket of leave. The colony's version of parole. A sliver of freedom carved out of punishment. And once he got that foothold, he didn't waste it. He clawed his way up from the bottom, trading sweat for soil, turning livestock into currency. By the mid-1820s, the same man who once passed a crooked note in London was walking tall as a prosperous farmer in Campbelltown. He was respectable, established, kind of man the townsfolk tipped their hats to. But respect is a fragile mask, and fortune is just another word for borrowed time. Fred Fisher had built himself a future, but the past and the kind of men who thrive in shadows, they were already waiting in the wings. By the winter of 1826, the shine on Fred Fisher's new life was already starting to tarnish. On the surface, he was a respected man in Campbelltown, but respect is a currency that can go bankrupt overnight. Behind the smiles and handshakes, there were cracks. Chief among them, a festering feud with his neighbor, George Worrall. Worrall wore the face of a friend, but underneath he was all sharp edges and hungry eyes, the kind of man who saw every debt in dispute as an open wound to pick at. You think this land is yours by right, Fisher, but a man's fortune has a way of changing hands. Land, money, ownership. It was fertile soil for betrayal, and something poisonous had already taken root. Then came the night of June 17th. Fisher didn't leave a note, didn't tie up any loose ends, didn't even bother to saddle his horse. He just vanished. One moment a man with a future, the next a ghost story waiting to be written. Worrall was quick to fill the silence. He spun the town a tale about Fisher. Who, me mate Fred? No, he's off to London, left me to mind the farm. Generous chap, really. He claimed his absent friend had left him in charge of the farm. It was a neat little story, tied with a bow, but Campbelltown wasn't buying it. Fisher had unfinished business in town. His horse stood idle. His possessions gathered dust. And worst of all, Worrall strutted around like he already owned the place. He didn't just act like a caretaker, he acted like a king, and kings don't rise that fast without blood in the foundation of their kingdom. Months dragged by with no sign of Fisher, and the unease grew heavier, thick as storm clouds. Then in September, the dam finally cracked. A man named John Farley stumbled into O'Connell's Inn with his face pale and his nerves frayed raw. Farley wasn't a drunk or a fool. He was a man the town trusted, and that made what he had to say all the more chilling. He told them he passed a small bridge near Fisher's farm, and there on the rail sat a figure. Fred Fisher. Only it wasn't flesh and bone, he said. It was smoke and shadow. A man-shaped hole in the world.
I swear on me life, I saw him sitting on the rail. Fisher himself, clear as day, but I could see right through him.
Farley swore he could see straight through Fisher. The apparition sat silent, then lifted an arm and pointed down toward the creek below, like a judge passing sentence. But then it was gone, leaving nothing but the sound of water sliding past in the dark. When Farley spilled the story to the men in the pub, the air shifted. Laughter died, glasses froze mid-raise. The room felt colder. They all knew what this meant. Fisher hadn't gone back to England. He was still there. In one form or another, and his ghost had just bust the case wide open. The law had been digging around a little already, but Farley's vision caused them to get actual shovels. The investigation was set in motion. Constable Trooper Leland was called in, joined by 2 Aboriginal trackers, Jackie Gilbert and Jojo. It said these men could read the ground like preachers read the Bible, finding truths in the dirt that others would never see. They moved across Fisher's land until they reached a low patch near the waterhole, the kind of ground that looked ordinary to most eyes, but the trackers noticed what the earth was whispering. Slight depressions, disturbed soil, marks that didn't quite belong. The place had the quiet weight of a secret, and secrets buried in the earth rarely stay quiet forever. The trackers' instincts were dead on. October 25th, 1826, the shovels bit into the marshy earth, and the ground finally gave up its secrets. What they pulled out wasn't just a body, It was the truth rotting and silent. Like Cain striking Abel, someone bashed Fisher's skull in. His bones now told the tale, but Fisher's blood cried out long before then. Fred Fisher hadn't gone back to England. He'd gone into the dirt. The trail of suspicion led straight to George Worrall, the man who stood to gain the most, and the man the authorities already had their eyes on, but nothing to sink their teeth into. They dragged him in. He played dumb at first, swearing innocence with the kind of smooth denial only a guilty man can muster.
Come on, gentlemen, I had nothing to do with it. Fred was me mate. I wouldn't hurt a fly.
But the evidence piled up like storm clouds. Forged documents conveniently shifting Fisher's world into Worrall's hands, showing he'd do more than hurt a fly. Neighbors whispered about his swagger, how he sold off stock and property as if Fred had never existed. And the body itself, buried practically in Worrall's shadow, that was the final nail in his coffin. By February 1827, the colony was ready for its show. Sydney's Supreme Court was packed to the rafters, the murder and the ghost story already the talk of the town. Worrall denied everything, but the jury wasn't buying it. They found him guilty. The judge delivered the only sentence that mattered back then: death by hanging. February 5th, 1827, Darlinghurst Jail. Worrall walked up to the gallows with the crowd watching, a mob hungry for justice dressed up as entertainment. He'd spent months puffing his chest, but when the rope touched his neck, the mask slipped. He confessed. I done it. But it was an accident, it was. You gotta believe me. Still no remorse from his mouth. He was trying to erase the blame, claiming he thought Fred was an animal or something in the field. It didn't help his case. All it did was help strip away the last shadow of doubt they had their man. Fred Fisher hadn't left his farm behind. He'd been snuffed out by the very man who called himself a friend. The motives were as old as sin: jealousy and greed. Worrall wanted the land, the livestock, the fortune that Fisher had clawed out of the dirt. For that, he bashed a man's head wide open and tried to bury the truth in a shallow grave. But justice has a way of clawing back from the earth. Blood, a way of crying out. When the trapdoor fell and the rope went taut, Worrall paid in full. What he left behind wasn't redemption. It was legend. And through it all, the ghost sat on the sidelines. Farley's vision never made it into the courtroom. The judge and jury didn't deal in phantoms. They dealt in paperwork, testimony, and bones pulled from the earth. The ghost stayed in the dark corners of the story outside the formal record, where folklore takes root. Historians still argue over where it began. Maybe Farley invented the tale, a convenient spark to explain why suspicion drifted toward the creek. Maybe his reputation as a sober, trustworthy man made his words too heavy to dismiss. In a town where rumor moved faster than fact, the story spread like wildfire. Whether he saw something spectral or just the shadow of his own imagination, no one can say for sure. But what we do know is this: the ghost became welded to the crime, inseparable from the facts. Fisher's ghost turned a backwater murder into one of Australia's most enduring legends. So this week we take a break from poltergeist activity and we examine the fascinating tale of Fisher's ghost. Frederick George James Fisher, better known simply as Fred Fisher, began life far from Australia. He was in fact born in London in 1792. Fisher's troubles began in London in 1815. Paper money was still a relatively new feature of everyday trade, and forged banknotes were spreading through the city like a plague.
Forgers and passers of bad notes were considered a serious threat to the economy, and the courts punished the crime with great severity. Fisher wasn't a hardened criminal in the traditional sense. He was no highwayman or cutthroat. He was a tradesman who made the disastrous decision to try his hand at passing off forged notes as real. But in a time when Britain was already tightening its grip on law and order, that single misstep sealed his fate. On July 26, 1815, Fisher was convicted at Surrey jail delivery for
Uttering forged banknotes.
Instead of the gallows, the court chose another sentence that was almost as grim: 14 years transportation. For many, that meant exile for life. Transportation was more than just a punishment. It was a one-way ticket out of England, branding a man as cargo in the empire's human trade. Shackled aboard a prison ship, Fisher became one of thousands of convicts shipped across the world to the harsh and unfamiliar penal colony of New South Wales. The year was 1815, and the voyage itself could take months, crammed into the dark belly of a vessel where disease, despair, and salt air marked every day. By the time Fisher set foot on Australian soil in 1816, he had been stripped of his old life, his freedom, and his future. At least that was how it seemed. For most men transported under sentence, there was no way back. Fisher's new life began under the weight of chains, but over time he carved out something different for himself. After serving part of his sentence, he was granted a ticket of leave, the colonial equivalent of parole, which allowed him to work and live more freely. With hard work and a sharp mind for opportunity, Fisher turned his fortune around. He acquired land and livestock, and by the mid-1820s, he had established himself as a prosperous farmer in the growing township of Campbelltown. Once branded a criminal, now Fisher had become a respected member of the community, a man with wealth, property, and a promising future ahead of him. By the winter of 1826, dark clouds were already gathering over Fisher's life. Though he was respected in Campbelltown, not all of his relationships were secure. He had an ongoing dispute with his neighbor and supposed friend, George Worrall. Like most of the men in this tale, George Worrall's story began far from the colony. Born around 1787 in Cheshire, England, he was no stranger to hardship or the law. At some point before 1813, he was tried and sentenced to the harshest punishment short of the gallows: life transportation. For a man in his 20s, it meant exile across the world, branded forever as a convict of the crown. In 1813, Worrall sailed aboard the Earl Spencer to New South Wales, one of thousands of unwilling passengers carried in the dark holds of Britain's convict fleet. Upon arrival, he was absorbed into the machinery of colonial life. Like so many convicts, his labor was parceled out to men of standing. He first worked under the stern oversight of Reverend Samuel Marsden at Parramatta, known as the flogging parson, infamous for his uncompromising rule over those placed in his charge. Later, Worrall was resigned to John Dight, a free settler and farmer whose household would have given him a different rhythm of work, but no less a reminder that his life was not his own. As with Fisher, time and good behavior eventually brought rewards. By 1822, Worrall had secured a ticket of leave, the document that loosened the chains of his sentence. It allowed him to move and work within certain boundaries so long as he remained under the watchful eye of the authorities. It wasn't freedom, but it was a taste of it, a sliver of normal life after years of harsh servitude. By 1825, Worrall's fortune had improved enough that in the colonial musters he could list his occupation as farmer. To go from a convict in chains to a man of the soil within a decade was no small transformation. It marked the colony's strange paradox. Men shipped out as criminals could, with discipline and shrewdness, reinvent themselves as settlers. To his neighbors, George Worrall was no longer just another transported man. He was a farmer, a figure trying to pass for respectable in the raw frontier world of early Campbelltown. By the mid-1820s, Fisher and George Worrall were more than just neighbors. They were considered friends, or at least allies, bound by proximity in the shared struggle of carving out a livelihood in the colony. Their relationship was close enough that Fisher placed in Worrall a significant degree of trust. In early 1826, Fisher faced charges of using forged documents and was briefly imprisoned. To To safeguard his interests during that time, Fisher gave Worrall power of attorney over his property. It was no small gesture. This arrangement meant that Worrall was legally empowered to manage Fisher's land and affairs, a responsibility only given to someone believed to be reliable and loyal. Worrall even lived on Fisher's farm for a time, further cementing the impression of friendship and mutual reliance. Yet beneath that surface of trust, there were signs of strain. Reports from the period suggest that disagreements arose between the two men, centering on land, boundaries, debts, and unsettled claims. Such disputes were not unusual in early colonial life, where lines between properties were often blurred and fortunes could turn on a single acre of fertile ground. But in the case of Fisher and Worrall, these conflicts took on a sharper edge. Worrall's reputation in the district was not sterling. He was often described as shifty, opportunistic, the sort of man who could turn friendship into leverage when it suited him. Where Fisher was viewed as a prospering and respectable farmer, Worrall was seen as a man still fighting to prove his stability. Again, the quarrel revolved around land, debts, and who truly held claim to what. Fertile ground for greed to fester. Then, on the night of June 17th, 1826, Fisher simply vanished. No farewell, no business wrapped up, no trace of where he might have gone. George Worrall quickly stepped into the silence, telling anyone who asked,
"Oh, Fisher sailed for England, left me in charge of his farm and his affairs."
But as noted in our tale, Campbelltown wasn't convinced by shifty George. Fisher had ongoing business in town, matters he would have never abandoned without word. His personal possessions, from his horse to everyday items, remain untouched. And most troubling of all, Worrall began speaking as though the estate was already his, a presumption that set the townsfolk whispering. Something wasn't right. Fred Fisher hadn't left for England. He had disappeared, and George Worrall's story was wearing thin. 3 or 4 months passed with no sign of Fisher, and the unease in Campbelltown only deepened. Then in September of 1826, the story took the turn that would forever brand it into legend. That's when a man named John Farley burst into a local inn. Most versions of the tale say it was O'Connell's Inn. His face pale, his voice urgent. But who was John Farley? John Farley's story also began in London, where he stood trial at the Old Bailey on the 5th of December 1810. He was convicted of theft. He was sentenced to death. Like so many in that era, his sentence was commuted to transportation. In 1811, he was sent across the world as well. Farley arrived in New South Wales in January 1812 aboard the convict ship Guildford, one of many men cast out of England and forced to start over in the penal colony. Farley's name appears on the compiled passenger list for that voyage, marking the beginning of his new life in Australia. By 1818, his circumstances had changed. Records show John Farley of Liverpool on the official list of persons granted land on the 10th of September that year. Whether through a petition for mitigation or simply through good conduct, his standing had eased enough for him to begin the slow climb from convict to landholder, much like Fisher. The details of the petition itself are uncertain, but the land grant is fact. By the mid-1820s, Farley had built a reputation that stood in stark contrast to his convict origins. Local leaders such as Reverend Thomas Wrestles and Major Henry Antill described him as capable and industrious, a man respected in the Campbelltown community. Whatever his past, Farley had become part of the colony's fabric, trusted enough that when he barged into the inn and spoke of ghastly visions on a bridge, people listened. He wasn't some drunkard spinning a yarn. He was a well-known local landowner, considered both reliable and sober, which made what he had to say all the more chilling. According to Farley, as he passed by a small bridge near Fisher's farm, he saw a figure sitting quietly on the wooden rail. At first glance, it might have been Fred himself, except that Fred was supposed to be in England, and what troubled him more was the figure wasn't opaque. Farley swore he could see straight through it. He said the apparition just sat there, silent, then slowly raised an arm and pointed down toward the creek that ran below. Farley froze in horror. Before he could make sense of it, he says the figure faded into nothing, leaving only the sound of water moving in the darkness. When Farley relayed this vision to the men in the pub, the effect was electric. The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank into their chests. Fisher's ghost was pointing to something hidden, and everyone knew what it implied.
The authorities already had their doubts about Worrall's story, but it's said that Farley's account lit a fire under the investigation. With that, the legend of Fisher's ghost had just been born, and it was about to lead to the grim discovery of the truth. The ghost story may have stirred the town, but it was the police investigation that finally uncovered what had happened. Authorities dispatched Constable Trooper Lewland, often recorded and pronounced as Leland, alongside two highly skilled Aboriginal trackers known as Jackie Gilbert and Jojo to search Fisher's farm and the surrounding creek. These men had earned reputations for reading the land in ways European settlers could not, able to notice the smallest details others would pass by. As the party moved along the property, the trackers were drawn to a low-lying patch of ground near a waterhole, sometimes referred to as the marshy ground. To the untrained eye, it was just soft soil, but Gilbert and Jojo spotted what others missed: subtle disturbances, unnatural depressions, and marks that suggested something or someone had been buried there. The earth itself seemed to bear quiet witness to a crime. Their instincts proved right. It was on October 25, 1826, investigators began to dig. Soon the grim discovery was made. Beneath the marshy mound lay the decomposed body of Fred Fisher. The man remembered in most accounts as Jackie Gilbert is more accurately documented as Namut Gilbert, an Aboriginal or Darug leader from the Liverpool area. He wasn't a nameless helper in the background, he was explicitly credited with guiding the police to Fisher's grave in 1826, and his knowledge of the land made the difference between rumor and evidence. The trial records from 1827 make his role plain. They describe how Gilbert stopped near a waterhole, skimmed the scum from the surface, and unlike the song, he didn't say he found a white man's blood. Instead, he uttered the chilling words, "This is the fat of a white fellow." From there, he led the searchers toward the creek and the disturbed ground that concealed Fisher's remains. That phrase, strange and unsettling, became one of the most repeated lines in the legend, carried forward by local histories and retellings. In later accounts, the detail is sharpened. Gilbert is said to have tasted the puddles, declared them tainted with human fat, and in doing so pointed to the exact spot where the earth would finally give up its secrets. Gilbert's life outside this moment is also traceable in the records. By the 1830s, he was listed as the chief of the Liverpool tribe. Regional histories speak of his family connections. He was apparently married a few times, and his children were baptized in the 1820s. These glimpses remind us that Gilbert was more than a tracker in a single case. He was a leader, a husband, and a father, rooted in his community even as colonial pressures reshaped his world. Modern scholarship continues to acknowledge him, naming him as a Darug expert tracker tied to the Fisher case. Yet alongside Gilbert, later retellings often mention another tracker, simply called Jojo. Little is known about this man, and actual primary sources don't mention him at all, though the records name Gilbert directly. Sometimes they refer to Aboriginal men in the plural, but never provide a second name. Mentions of Jojo seem to appear only in later, unsourced versions of the story. On the evidence we have, his identity cannot be confirmed, leaving Gilbert as the sole figure we can securely place at the scene. Fisher's remains told their own story. The skeleton and fractured skull confirmed what many in Campbelltown already feared. Fred Fisher hadn't gone to England. He had been murdered and hidden in the earth not far from his own farm. As stated previously, with the discovery of Fisher's body, suspicion turned instantly to the man who had the most to gain, George Worrall. Their relationship shifted drastically in June of 1826. It was, of course, the night of the 17th when Fisher disappeared without warning. And now, October 25th of that year, Fisher's remains had been found around Worrall's property. Worrall was taken into custody without delay, but at first he protested his innocence, insisting he knew nothing of Fisher's fate. Yet the pieces of evidence stacking against him told a completely different story. The Aboriginals read the land, and investigators uncovered and read forged documents that Worrall had prepared, conveniently transferring ownership of Fisher's farm and assets into his own name. Neighbors and townsfolk came forward to testify his strange behavior in the weeks after Fisher's disappearance. Many modern criminals have been caught referring to missing people in the past tense. Worrall spoke as though the farm had already belonged to him, and he acted like it too, selling off stock and property with a brazenness that was hard to ignore. And most damning of all, the fact that Fisher's body was found so close to Worrall's land tied him directly to the crime. The case went to trial in February the following year, 1827, at Sydney's Supreme Court. The courtroom was packed, the story of the murder and the ghost sighting having already gripped the colony. Despite Worrall's denials, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury found him guilty of the murder of Fred Fisher, and the judge sentenced him to the ultimate punishment of the era, death by hanging. The date was set, and George Worrall would soon face the gallows. On February 5, 1827, George Worrall was led to the gallows of Darlinghurst Jail. The crowd gathered to witness what was, in those days, both justice and grim spectacle. Worrall had spent months denying any involvement in Fisher's disappearance, but as the noose was placed around his neck, his bravado crumbled. In those final moments, it's said that he confessed to the murder. The details he gave were sparse. Some accounts say he offered little more than an admission of guilt, while others suggest he hinted at how the deed was carried out, insisting it was all an accident. Whatever the exact words, the confession confirmed what Campbelltown already knew. Fred Fisher had not abandoned his farm. He had been struck down by the very man who claimed to be his friend. The motives appeared to be as simple as they were cold: old-fashioned jealousy and greed, a tale as old as time. Worrall wanted Fisher's property, his livestock, his farm, and the wealth that came with it. For that, he had been willing to take a man's life and attempt to bury the body and the truth in a shallow grave by a creek. It's important to note that the ghost sighting itself was never presented in court. The judge and jury dealt strictly with the evidence: Worrall's forged papers, the testimony of witnesses, and the grim discovery of Fisher's body on his property. Farley's vision of the ghost remained outside the legal record, preserved instead in the realm of story and legend. Historians do still debate, though, how the story began. Some suggest that Farley may have invented the tale after the fact, a convenient way to explain why suspicion turned toward the creek where Fisher's body was found.
Well, that's what anyone with any sense would conclude.
Rude, but I guess I should be glad you waited this long to run your mouth. Others argue that Farley, standing as a man known for sobriety and reliability, gave his account weight. In a small colonial town where news traveled slowly but whispers moved like lightning, John Farley's account spread with an intensity no official report could match.
Well, it has been said that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes.
Very true. What's also true is it's hard to find out who actually came up with that quote. It's been credited to like 9 different guys.
Wasn't it by Mark Twain?
Actually, no. The well-known line is often credited to Twain, but evidence doesn't support the attribution. The real origins can be traced to much earlier. In 1710, the satirist Jonathan Swift wrote in his essay, The Examiner, "Falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it." This is the earliest documented form of the idea, but you're right, it captures the sharp contrast between the speed of a lie and the slow progress of the truth. But none of that helps us to determine what's true in this case. Fact and rumor blurred together in Campbelltown's taverns and kitchens until Farley's vision became the story everyone repeated. Whether Farley truly saw something spectral on that bridge, or whether the tale was born out of imagination or even the need to give shape to lingering suspicions, no one can say for certain. What we can say is that the ghost entered the bloodstream of the case and never left it. The legend of Fisher's ghost transformed what might have been remembered as just another grim colonial murder into one of Australia's most enduring ghost stories. The tale has outlived the crime itself, woven into Campbelltown's identity. Every year the town still honors the story with the Festival of Fisher's Ghost, a curious blend of folklore, justice, and community spirit. It is a civic reminder that sometimes the myth surrounding a crime becomes just as powerful as the crime itself, and that stories can echo longer than the lives that birthed them. The legend has only grown with time. Some say that on certain nights, Fisher's ghost can still be seen lingering on the bridge, silent and watchful, pointing to the creek where his life was cut short.
Alright, let's just cut through the campfire and pub smoke here. Farley saw nothing but his own nerves reflected in the dark. Fisher's ghost didn't point to a creek. That's folklore layered on top of an already clear-cut murder case. The body was found because of skilled trackers, not because a phantom played tour guide.
Ah, come on, Doc, what are you talking about? You acting like every spooky story is just indigestion and moonlight. Farley was a respected dude, not some rando slouching out of the pub. He didn't make this up to score free drinks. People believed him because he wasn't the type to spin fairy tales.
Belief doesn't equal truth, Vincent. Salem believed in witches doesn't mean broomsticks were parked outside every house. You got a small town primed for suspicion, a missing man, and nervous witnesses who saw what everyone already feared. That's psychology, not the supernatural.
Psychology, yeah, it explains a lot, but it don't explain the timing, Doc. He sees Fisher sitting on the bridge, points to the creek, and boom, weeks later they dig up Fisher's body right there. Coincidence? I think not. Maybe, just maybe, the dead don't stay quiet when they've been wronged.
Coincidence wrapped in narrative. The human brain is built to connect dots and see patterns even when they don't line up. Farley's tale was retrofitted into the legend once Fisher's body was uncovered. That's how folklore works. Ghosts don't solve crimes, evidence does.
Tell that to half the ghost stories around the world. Doc Fisher's case became legend because the supernatural fit the facts too clean to ignore. You can't bury truth under dirt without something breaking through. Sometimes it's bones, sometimes it's a ghost on a bridge. Well, sometimes maybe it's both.
Oh, come on, don't tell me you buy into this Fisher's ghost nonsense.
Look, the historical evidence doesn't tie everything up as neatly as you'd like, Doc. There are many that suggest that even though the authorities were investigating the case, and they even suspected Worrall, they had hit a wall in the investigation until Farley's story.
Here's the problem with the neat little ghost broke the case line. Contemporary records do not put a phantom on the witness stand. The court and police materials that survive point to the human work on the ground, especially the trackers who guided authorities to disturb soil near the creek. That is evidence, not ectoplasm. Campbelltown's own histories celebrate the legend today, but they also note the festival and folklore grew much later, while the trial itself turned on paperwork, testimony, and a body, not Farley's visions. Farley's tale accelerated public interest? Fine, but the legal gears turned because investigators found a grave where a man had been murdered and a forger turned neighbors stood to gain. Folklore retrofits meaning after the fact. It does not do the digging.
Yeah, Doc, we all know the jury didn't call Casper to the stand. Nobody's saying the judge took testimony from beyond the grave. But you're acting like Farley's vision was just noise. In a little colonial town, rumors carried more weight than a wagon full of law books. Farley's story lit a match. Without that push, maybe the trooper and Gilbert never looked where they did. You call it folklore, I call it the spark that turned suspicion into action. Bones and forged papers might have sealed the coffin, but what if the ghost cracked it open? Consider this. In January of 1897, the quiet hills of Greenbrier County, West Virginia, became the setting for one of the strangest stories in American legal history. Elva Zona Heister Shue, known simply as Zona, was discovered lifeless in her home. Her husband, Erasmus Edward Shue, insisted she had collapsed from a sudden heart condition. A doctor was called to the house, but Edward behaved oddly, hovering over his wife's body and refusing to let the physician perform a thorough examination. Pressured into accepting Edward's word, the doctor signed off on a death certificate that listed the cause of death as everlasting faint, a vague and unusual phrase that essentially closed the matter. At least it would have, if not for Zona's mother. Mary Jane Heister never accepted her daughter's death as natural. Grief-stricken but resolute, she later claimed that Zona's spirit came to her on 4 consecutive nights. In those visions, she said her daughter revealed the truth. Edward had strangled her in a fit of rage. Zona's ghost described how he broke her neck and recounted details of cruelty and abuse from their brief marriage. Most chilling of all, Mary Jane claimed the apparition physically demonstrated the broken neck by turning its head all the way around. Whether dream, vision, or hallucination, the experience left Mary Jane utterly convinced that her daughter had been murdered. Driven by these encounters, Mary Jane went straight to the local prosecutor, John Preston, and demanded that Zona's body be exhumed. Though reluctant, officials eventually agreed, and in February 1897, the grave was opened. What the autopsy revealed shocked everyone. Zona's neck had been violently broken. The bones showed fractures, her windpipe was crushed, and bruising confirmed she had been strangled to death. The everlasting faint vanished as an explanation. There was no doubt now that Zona had been murdered. Edward Shue was promptly arrested and charged with his wife's killing. When the trial began, Mary Jane took the witness stand and under oath recounted her story of the ghostly visits for 4 nights. The defense tried to portray her as unreliable, perhaps even delusional, but she stood her ground. Importantly, the jury was not asked to convict on the word of a ghost alone. The case was built on the medical findings and on testimony about Shue's controlling, abusive behavior, along with his suspicious attempts to prevent the first doctor from examining the body. Still, the ghost story loomed over the trial, fueling public interest and shaping the atmosphere in the courtroom. In the end, Edward Shue was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. His life was cut short only a few years later in 1900 when he died of measles while incarcerated. The Greenbrier ghost case remains one of a kind in American history. Ghost testimony was not struck from the record. The judge allowed the jury to hear it, instructing them to weigh it as they saw fit. While Shu's conviction rested on physical evidence, Mary Jane's persistence, sparked by her visions, was what forced the autopsy and uncovered the truth. Without her, Zona's death might have been dismissed as nothing more than a fainting spell. Today, a historical marker still stands in Greenbrier County, honoring the case and noting its extraordinary place in history. It's the only recorded instance in the United States where a ghost story directly influenced the outcome of a murder investigation. Look, folks, I'm not going to drag this thing out today. I'm going to be clear and say that I do think it is within the realm of possibility that a ghost or ghastly spirit could have perhaps aided in the solving of these crimes and many other like them. A biblical framework can actually help us think about ghostly leads in murder cases without even endorsing necromancy or superstition. Scripture is clear that God exposes hidden things, often through surprising or even unsettling means. Daniel 2:22 declares that God reveals deep and hidden things and knows what dwells in the darkness. Jesus himself said that nothing hidden will remain concealed forever, for nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest. Luke 8:17. Ecclesiastes 12:14 adds that God will bring every secret act into judgment. From a biblical standpoint, then, it is not hard to see how strange nudges, disturbing dreams, or even reported visions could serve as part of God's providence in uncovering a crime. The point is not to validate necromancy, but to affirm that God is sovereign over how truth comes to light. One of the oldest biblical themes is that innocent blood cries out for justice. When Cain murdered Abel, God declared, "The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground," in Genesis 4:10. Numbers 35:33 teaches that the land itself is defiled by bloodshed, while Habakkuk 2:11 poetically describes stones and beams crying out against injustice. In this way, creation itself testifies against hidden sin. Within the story of Fisher's ghost, the apparition pointing toward the creek can be understood as a dramatic retelling of that biblical truth. The murdered man's blood, buried in the earth, could not stay silent. Whether Farley truly saw a figure or only felt the weight of his conscience and the suspicion of the town, the theology still stands. Blood cries out, God hears, justice awakens. God also works through dreams and visions to prompt decisive action. Joseph was warned in dreams to protect the infant Christ from Herod's slaughter in Matthew 2. Pilate's wife was troubled in a dream and warned her husband not to condemn an innocent man, Matthew 27. In Acts, visions repeatedly direct people to go to the right place at the right time, leading to conversions and critical decisions. None of these visions replaced evidence or due process, but they did provide divine direction. In that same way, Farley's supposed experience does not serve as courtroom proof, rather it can be treated as a providential prompt that pushed the authorities to dig in the right place and uncover real, tangible evidence. As noted many times before, Scripture also shows that God has, on rare occasions, permitted the appearance of the dead for his own purposes. At the Transfiguration, Moses appeared and spoke with Jesus as part of God's redemptive plan, Matthew 17. And in the famous passage we always talk about on here, 1 Samuel 28, the prophet Samuel confronted King Saul with judgment even after death by God's allowance. These events were never normal or repeatable, nor do they justify attempts to summon the dead. But they demonstrate that God can permit such appearances in very controlled and purposeful ways. If Fisher's ghost were an actual apparition, then theologically, it would have to be understood not as a human conjuring, but as a sovereign act allowed by God for the sake of justice. At the same time, God's law draws a clear boundary. We are forbidden from seeking out the dead or dabbling in occult practices. Deuteronomy 18 we've talked about many times. This sets the guardrails. Christians do not chase messages from spirits, nor do we endorse seances or divination. Yet God in his sovereignty may still use an unsettling dream, a rumor, or a disturbing vision to direct people toward truth and justice. The sin is in seeking occult power. The grace is in God overruling even strange experiences to accomplish his purposes. When it comes to justice, Scripture insists on tangible proof, not spectral testimony. Deuteronomy 19:15 requires that every matter be established by multiple witnesses, and Proverbs counsels against hasty conclusions. Farley's story, then, cannot be treated as the verdict, nor could Mary Jane's. They were merely the spark that set investigations in motion. In the end, Fisher's case, like the Greenbrier ghost case in America, was not resolved by ghostly testimony, but by physical evidence, bones, documents, and corroborating witnesses. This distinction preserves biblical justice while still acknowledging the mysterious way truth may come to light. Finally, any pastoral reflection on stories like this must account for spiritual warfare. The Bible warns that spirits can deceive and even disguise themselves as messengers of light. 1 John 4, 2 Corinthians 11, common verses we've talked about before. Two possibilities can be considered. The first is that God, in His sovereignty, permitted the vision itself. Whether it was truly Fisher allowed to appear for a moment, or another spirit permitted to take on his likeness, the purpose would have been to drive the living toward uncovering the truth. The second possibility is that a demonic spirit conjured the appearance. So many wish to label everything paranormal as demonic. Yet in this case, this explanation breaks down under scrutiny. What sense would it make for an agent of deception to aid the cause of justice? The devil is called a murderer and the father of lies, not the revealer of hidden crimes. For that reason, if the accounts are true, the more coherent reading is that God allowed the visions in some form not to indulge superstition, but to push events toward the exposure of murder and the execution of justice. In either case, the ultimate outcome aligned with Romans 13, where governing authorities are described as God's servants bearing the sword to punish evil. The homiletic through line is clear: innocent blood cries out, and God hears. Sometimes that cry takes the shape of a vision on a bridge. Other times it comes through the grief of a mother's dream. But in every case, the God of Scripture is the one who brings hidden things to light. The guardrails remain firm. We do not seek the dead. We seek the Lord, and we allow lawful investigation to do its work. The payoff is simple and powerful. Whether Farley saw Fisher's ghost or merely felt the weight of Fisher's blood crying out, God used it to move the living toward truth, where evidence could speak in the court and justice could be done.
Oh, that's real tidy, isn't it? God lets one ghost pop up in colonial Australia, points to a creek, and boom, case closed. But if that's how divine justice works, why doesn't He send ghosts to solve every cold case? Why aren't the streets of London, New York, or Chicago and Sydney filled with spectral informants pointing out where the bodies are buried? Last I checked, unsolved murders pile up by the thousands. If the system was ghost tip-offs by Providence, the world would be a crime-free utopia by now. Instead, what do we actually get? Hard evidence, investigations doing legwork, and courtrooms built on testimony and documents, not midnight apparitions.
Wait a minute. I hear what you're saying about God allowing these spirits to appear, and I'm all for it. And I never thought I'd hear myself saying this, though, but the doc might be onto something. Why don't God do this more often? Why are these stories the exception and not the norm? Ouch, it's rare that the two of you are on the same page with anything, but I understand the question. Whether it's coming from a skeptical place or a sincere one, we long for justice. This is because we are made in the image of God who is just. This is why these kinds of stories resonate in us and why they endure. But I fear neither of you will love my answer. You see, God is not in the business of running some supernatural detective agency, dispatching ghosts or spirits to solve every cold case on our timeline. He doesn't answer to our systems or our schedules. He moves when it serves His purposes, not when it satisfies our curiosities. Sometimes He allows sin to run its course until the final judgment, and sometimes He breaks into history sooner, tearing the veil just enough so that the truth can't be ignored. The story of Fisher's ghost isn't about God making every murder neat and tidy. Perhaps it's about Him reminding us that buried truth doesn't stay buried forever. You can hide evidence, forge documents, and dig a grave in the marshy ground, but if God wills it, He can drag it back into the light. If stories like these are true and God ordained, why some and not others? Well, the first part of Deuteronomy 29:29 declares, "The secret things belong to the Lord our God." He would also reveal through the prophet Isaiah in chapter 55, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." We have no right to demand that He do anything at all. When I have questions about him and his ways, the first thing that usually takes place is the absolute crushing of my pride. And that's the hard truth, isn't it? We want God to work like a formula. We want him to step in every time someone lies, cheats, steals, or murders. But if he did, there'd be no room for faith, no room for grace either. For how often have you been the liar and the cheater or the thief? Hopefully not the murderer. There'd be no place for a world where justice sometimes seems delayed but never denied. Scripture is filled with stories where the wicked prosper for a season and the innocent suffer. Think about Job crying out, "Why do the wicked live on, growing old and increasing in power?" Or Habakkuk saying, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen?" These are not new questions, fellas. The truth is, when God does allow a Fisher's ghost or Greenbrier ghost to jolt the world into action, it's a mercy, a reminder that he is still the judge of all the earth. But the rest of the time, he calls us to walk by faith and not by sight. He has appointed a day when he will judge the secrets of every man through Christ Jesus. And on that day, every unsolved case will be solved, every hidden crime dragged into the light, every lie silenced. So no, God is not building a ghostly police force to keep us satisfied. Instead, he gives us glimpses, moments where heaven breaks through so we remember that he sees, that he hears, and he will not let innocent blood go unanswered. Our longing for justice, again, is not wasted. It's a longing that points us forward to the day when Christ himself will judge with perfect righteousness and absolute truth. Until then, we wrestle. We wrestle with the mystery. We cling to his promises. We trust his character. And we trust that nothing buried will stay buried forever. Not every crime gets a ghostly witness, but Scripture makes it clear that every sin will be answered for, if not in this life, most certainly in the next. Your sin has either been paid for by Jesus on the cross, or it will be paid for by you in an eternity separated from him forever. All right. I hear you. I get what you're saying. God ain't running no CSI Heavenly Edition, sending Casper down with subpoenas every time somebody goes missing. That makes sense, but I'm gonna be honest. It still bugs me, you know? We're talking about real people who got buried and forgotten. Families crying themselves asleep, wondering if the truth's ever gonna get out. And then once in a blue moon, bang, a ghost shows up, point to a creek, or a woman comes back from the grave whispering in her mother's dreams. You call that mercy? Doc calls it coincidence. I call it something that makes me lose sleep. If God's letting us see just a tiny taste of his justice peeking through the cracks, what does that say about the rest of the time when he keeps the curtain closed tight? That's the part that makes me nervous and confused. If he can rip the veil whenever he wants, but mostly he doesn't, well maybe he's reminding us he's the boss, not us. Still, I ain't gonna lie, if I drop dead in some alley and my case goes cold, you better believe I'm praying the Lord let me haunt somebody till the cops get the memo. Otherwise, forget Deuteronomy, I'm coming back swinging, just saying. Vinny, trust me, I hear you. It is unsettling because buried people and unanswered questions are not just statistics. They're names, faces, families who ache for closure. Your reaction is totally understandable. You're feeling the weight of injustice, and that weight is heavy because it's not the way the world was meant to be. But think about this. Every time we see one of those rare moments where the veil rips and truth comes out in a way we can't explain, it isn't God teasing us. It is a reminder that the curtain isn't locked forever. There is a day circled on God's calendar where every secret will be shouted from the rooftops, every hidden thing will be exposed, and every wrong will be answered for. The question is, do we want God to crack the curtain open just enough to keep us awake, or do we demand he tear it down right now on our terms? If he did the second, justice would roll in like a flood, and none of us would be left standing, because our sins would be right there in the spotlight too. So yeah, if you get dropped in some alley and the case goes cold, don't worry about haunting the cops. If you belong to Christ, you've got a better advocate than a ghostly witness. The risen judge himself will plead your case, and he doesn't miss a thing. That's a better deal than swinging chains Jacob Marley style in the afterlife, trust me. And speaking of a Christmas carol, the influence of stories like Fred Fisher go well beyond folk songs and go back further than the 1800s. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, early 1600s, the ghost of King Hamlet is the catalyst for the entire play. Appearing to his son, the late king reveals that his death was no accident, but a calculated murder carried out by his own brother Claudius, who poured poison into his ear while he slept. The ghost's testimony shatters the illusion of natural succession and exposes a rotten core at the heart of Denmark's throne. This revelation not only sets Hamlet on a path of vengeance, but also plunges him into a spiral of doubt, moral conflict, and philosophical questioning. The ghost functions as both witness and accuser, a spectral informant whose words carry the weight of truth, but also force Hamlet to grapple with the reliability of supernatural signs. Without the ghost's intervention, Claudius's crime would have remained hidden, and the play would have lacked its central tension. In this way, Shakespeare taps into the timeless trope of a murdered spirit returning to demand justice, showing how buried sins eventually rise to the surface, whether through conscience, fate, or the supernatural. Into the modern day, in Stir of Echoes, directed by David Cope in 1999 and based on Richard Matheson's novel, Tom Witzke, played by Kevin Bacon, undergoes a life-altering experience after being hypnotized at a party. The hypnosis cracks open his perception of reality, allowing him to see and hear the restless ghost of a teenage girl named Samantha. Her spirit doesn't appear as a harmless presence, but as a tormented soul demanding recognition. Through visions, nightmares, and fragments of memory not his own, Tom is drawn into the mystery of her disappearance. The haunting intensifies until he is compelled to dig, literally, into the foundation of his home, where he uncovers Samantha's hidden body. This shocking revelation exposes the men who silenced her and unmasks a crime that the living had tried to bury. The ghost in Stir of Echoes is both catalyst and guide, her suffering echoing so powerfully that it breaks into the world of the living until the truth can no longer be ignored. Then the following year, in 2000, in What Lies Beneath, directed by Robert Zemeckis, the idyllic facade of a comfortable Vermont home begins to unravel when Claire Spencer, played by Michelle Pfeiffer, is haunted by strange, unsettling visions. At first, she believes the ghostly presence is a troubled neighbor, but as the manifestations grow stronger, she uncovers a darker truth. The spirit is that of a young woman murdered by Claire's husband, Dr. Norman Spencer, played by Harrison Ford. He's a respected professor who has buried both his crime and the evidence of his affair. The ghost's relentless haunting is not random terror, but a powerful pursuit of justice, guiding Claire toward the hidden body and forcing the truth into the open. The film plays on the Gothic tradition of buried sins clawing their way back into the light, with the ghost serving as both victim and avenger, ensuring that what was concealed in life cannot remain hidden in death.
See, this is exactly my point. From Hamlet to What Lies Beneath, we're not talking about eyewitness testimony from the grave. We're talking about storytellers using ghosts as a narrative device. Shakespeare wasn't running a seance on the Globe Theatre stage. He was dramatizing betrayal, justice, and the rotten mess of human politics. In Hollywood, they know nothing sells tickets faster than a restless spirit with unfinished business. In all three examples, the ghost is the hook that keeps the audience leaning forward. Hamlet's father drives the plot, Samantha's haunting pushes Bacon to grab a shovel, and the dead mistress drags Harrison Ford's skeleton out of the closet. These are metaphors dressed in sheets, not case studies in the paranormal. The message underneath is what matters. Truth has a way of clawing itself out of the dirt, no matter how deep you try to bury it. Now, I'm not denying that folklore, like Fisher's Ghost, feeds into this tradition, but if we're being honest, those Campbelltown stories are more about human guilt and gossip than they are about divine justice flicking on a flashlight from the other side. So before we start chalking up ghosts as God's little crime stoppers, maybe we should admit we're looking at centuries of storytelling, not supernatural subpoenas.
You're right, Doc. Shakespeare wasn't conducting ghost tours, and Hollywood sure isn't in the business of recording case files for the paranormal. Stories like Hamlet, Stir of Echoes, and What Lies Beneath are written to entertain, unsettle, and hold up a mirror to the human condition. But the reason ghosts work so powerfully as storytelling device is because they echo something deeper inside of us. We live in a world where truth often gets buried, where evil men hide their crimes behind polished appearances, and where the innocent are silenced. The ghost becomes a symbol of that silenced voice breaking through the dirt, crying out for justice. You're right to say the message underneath matters more than the apparition itself, but that message lines up with something Scripture affirms. Numbers 32:23 says, "Be sure your sin will find you out." Jesus again said himself that nothing is hidden that will not be disclosed, or concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open. So yes, maybe Fisher's Ghost belongs in the same tradition as Shakespeare or Zemeckis, a story that uses the dead to remind the living that justice can't stay buried forever. But where you see only metaphor, I'd argue God sometimes allows the real world to borrow that script. And when he does, it isn't about entertaining an audience. It's about reminding us that he is the judge, and no Claudius, no Norman Spencer, and no George Worrall gets away from their crimes forever. So where does that leave Fisher's ghost? Well, on one level, it is Campbelltown folklore that grew around a very real murder. The court convicted George Worrall on evidence, not on phantoms. The town kept the legend because stories help communities carry grief and warn the living that buried truth rises. Campbelltown still marks its every year with the Festival of Fisher's Ghost, proof that the tale outlived the trial. On another level, there was real human skill behind the breakthrough. The trackers properly led police to Fisher's grave in 1826, a fact preserved in Sydney histories and Liverpool's First Nations records. And at the deepest level, Scripture says God brings hidden things into the light. Innocent blood cries out. So here is my pastoral takeaway. As always, do not seek counsel from the dead, ever. Do not build cases on visions. Do seek the Lord. Do pursue evidence, due process, and justice. If God sometimes lets a startling nudge aim the shovel in the right direction, the verdict still belongs to the facts. That is how Greenbrier worked in West Virginia. A mother's insistence opened a grave, but bones, bruising, and testimony convicted a killer. A case still remembered on a state marker. Which brings us back to that bridge. Whether Farley saw a specter or carried the town's suspicion in his gut, Fisher's blood cried out. The earth answered, and God who hears, let truth surface in time. If our story today stirred you, share the episode. That's how people are going to find out about the show. Share it with a friend who loves history and a good mystery. If you want to help me continue to do these deep dives, join the Toasties on Patreon. Help me keep the lights on in Ashwood Pines. Links for everything, as always, are in the show notes. I don't say that part often enough. For my Aussie listeners, sorry for all the mispronunciations and bad accents. I thank you for your hospitality from across the Pacific. Maybe one day I'll come out to visit. I just might have to skip spider season. As always, I want to thank all of you for listening to The Dancing Toaster. Next week, we're off to just 900 miles southeast of Australia, to New Zealand. My goal is to examine one of their most famous paranormal cases as we continue our trip around the top 5 countries where people are tuning in to The Dancing Toaster. But no matter where you're tuning in, please like, share, subscribe, comment, follow, do all the things wherever you consume The Dancing Toaster. But whatever you do, don't consume toasters, and don't let any vengeful ghosts consume you. I love you. I'm out.
Report suspicious activities and call 911 for immediate response. Expect delay.
Nobody else is moving tags in from the south. Stand by.
Flight 022. Maintain approach. You're clear for
Expect traffic delays and restrictions. Take personal security precautions to avoid becoming a victim of an attack. Avoid crowded public areas and gatherings. Not travel in areas affected by the attack or in a known area elevated virus activity. Keep emergency supplies accessible and holding a gas at all times.
Be careful.
Government officials insist that this is an isolated incident difficult to attack and prevent. Okay, well, perhaps we will continue to keep you informed.